Sabah al-Khair, good morning dear listeners. You're listening to Radio 3CR on 855 AM and Palestine Remembered with Robert Martin, Nasser Mashni and Yusuf Ahmed al-Rimawi.
Palestine Remembered is Australia's only English language radio program that is totally dedicated to Palestine. We'd like to welcome those listening on 855 and those that will join us on podcast at 3cr.org.au.
Thanks for joining us. Stay with us and enjoy the episode.
Bringing you the news and views and the untold side of the Palestinian struggle for freedom from a Palestinian perspective. Good morning, listeners. Welcome to another episode of Palestine Remembered. Today, a special and exclusive for you, the Edward Said Memorial Lecture. This year, the Australian Friends of Palestine Association in South Australia has invited Dr. Yara Hawari from Palestine to deliver the Edward Said Memorial Lecture. Sit back, relax, and enjoy this wonderful presentation, chaired brilliantly by AFOPA's President, Edie Bainsbury.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. And to Yara Hawari in Palestine, good morning. I'm Edie Bransbury. I'm chairperson of the Australian Friends of Palestine here in Adelaide, South Australia. I welcome you to tonight's lecture, which of course is held in remembrance of the life of the late Edward Said, a Palestinian-American professor of literature who taught at Columbia University and a public intellectual and a founder of the academic field of post-colonial studies. In the last 2 decades, Edward Said was America's most prominent advocate for Palestinian rights. Tonight marks the 17th year of the lecture series, and AFOPA is proud to bring to you Dr. Yara Hawari as its guest speaker. Dr. Hawari is a Palestinian academic and writer living in occupied Palestine, from where she'll be delivering her talk this evening. Dr. Hawari obtained her PhD in Middle East Studies at the University of Exeter. Her research focused on oral history and Indigenous studies. She works as a senior analyst with Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network, which is a transnational think tank. She writes extensively on all areas of politics in Palestine and Israel, including issues relating to international law and advocacy. She's a frequent political commentator for media outlets, including The Guardian, Foreign Policy, and Al Jazeera English. She's also author of Stone House, published late last year, and is host of the podcast Rethinking Palestine, which is really good listening. I now give you Dr. Yara Hawari.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you, Australian Friends of Palestine Association, for hosting me for this year's talk. As mentioned, I am calling in from colonized Palestine, which has been surviving and resisting against settler colonial erasure for over 7 decades. I know that I don't need to explain settler colonialism to all of you in Australia, but there is something important to say and highlight, and that's whilst all cases of settler colonialism have their peculiarities and different characteristics, they always follow the same pattern and logic of Indigenous erasure, and they end up copying each other's narratives and mechanisms of oppression much more than we know. And the Israeli regime is no exception to that. And it's important to mention this because one of the underpinnings of the Zionist narrative is that it's a project in Palestine, or its project in Palestine, and the Israeli state itself are exceptional. And this is a narrative that adopts notions such as, the Israeli state surviving against all odds, and that the Zionist project is about a people returning to their homeland as promised by biblical scriptures, etc., etc. This is not an exceptional narrative at all. And actually, world over, settler colonialists and even bog standard colonialists have used similar language to justify colonization of Indigenous and native land. For example, settler colonialists in West Africa in the 1800s used a biblical narrative, and they claimed that they were returning to the original land of civilization where it all first began, and that they were the rightful owners of this land. And similarly in Australia, settler colonialists used this notion of terra nullius, empty land, to claim ownership In the 1930s, during fascist Italy's so-called pacification efforts in Libya, Mussolini sought to establish a new type of colony on appropriated Libyan land. And one of the underpinnings of this particular project was the notion that Italy was returning to Libya, which had once been under the Roman Empire. And so the Italian government built entire settler colonies prior to the arrival of these Italian settler farmers. The homes were already furnished. They built all these replica institutions of social, cultural, and political life of those in Italy. And even before David Ben-Gurion said it in the 1950s in Palestine, Mussolini used the biblical metaphor of making the desert bloom to imagine the fascist revitalization of Libya. Now, of course, in Libya and in Palestine, this making the desert bloom meant that the land had to be emptied of its indigenous population to make room for the settlers. And we know that most of the desert in Palestine is in the Naqab area, which is in the south. And during the 1948 Nakba, the Zionist forces expelled almost 90% of the 100,000 Bedouins that resided there to the West Bank, to Gaza, to Jordan, and Egypt. And today, thousands of Bedouins who are descendants of those that survived that original ethnic cleansing in 1948 are still facing house demolitions, displacement, resettlement in permanent towns to facilitate the Israeli regime plan to domesticate the desert and reclaim it for its own settlements. So it's not only these narratives, though, that are shared among these colonial and settler colonial projects, it's also mechanisms of oppression. This year, Amnesty International came out with a report condemning the Israeli regime to be one that is committing apartheid against the Palestinian people. And it comes off the back of other similar human rights organization reports, but more importantly, it comes off the back of many Palestinian scholars, activists, and experts who have identified apartheid as Israel's mechanism of containment and oppression of the Palestinian people. Now, of course, apartheid is known globally for what happened in South Africa, but even in international law, the definition makes it clear that this is a system of domination that can take different shapes and forms and can have different characteristics. And even settler colonialists themselves recognize that they are not exceptional, and they look to each other to maintain the oppression of indigenous people. So, for example, the Israeli regime and the South African apartheid regime were on very friendly terms during the South Africa apartheid era. And declassified South African documents even show how the Israeli regime offered to sell South Africa nuclear weapons in the 1950s, which, of course, it denied, because the Israeli regime neither denies nor confirms that it is the only regime in the Middle East with nuclear weapons. Now, the most obvious example of cozy relations between settler colonial states is that of the US and Israel. And this, of course, is a relationship that is not only based on shared values of racism and colonialism, but also of mutual interests. It's to the US's benefit that it maintains such a strong ally in the Middle East, almost functioning like an imperial buffer. And for the Israeli regime, the literally billions of dollars in military aid also comes in pretty useful. Now, why have I talked about de-exceptionalizing the Israeli regime and the Zionist settler colonial project in a talk about imagining the future? Well, it's because I think it's vitally important that we as Palestinians and many of you as allies of the Palestinian struggle understand intimately our current condition, and that it's not so different from other conditions of oppressed and colonized people in history. And I think from these shared and similar experiences of invasion and erasure, we can begin to paint a picture of a liberated Palestinian future. But I think I've just made it sound very easy, and that's actually far from the reality. Indian novelist and writer Arundhati Roy once wrote, "Remember this, another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing." Now, Roy's words are not only optimistic, they're also a very clear refusal of the unjust global reality that we live in, a reality in which the world continues on an unstoppable path of self-destruction, and where power structures that repress the majority of the Earth's population continue to be entrenched. The environment is being devastated to satiate unquenchable greed. The gap between rich and poor grows larger. Gender-based violence is a feature of daily life everywhere, and the colonial subjugation of the global south is continuous. So in this reality, it really is a remarkable feat to be able to remain optimistic and imagine a different future. And particularly speaking from Palestine, I struggle to hear the breathing of this other word that Roy writes about. Even when I shut out the deafening noise of injustice and oppression, I really struggled to hear even a whisper of this other world. But it is important for us to recognize that the inability to see beyond the present and imagine a world otherwise is not a coincidence. It's actually by design. Now, among many things, settler colonial projects control perceptions of reality that bind Indigenous and colonized people into a seemingly perpetual state of being. And this control is cemented through the building of colonial infrastructure, the establishment of colonial institutions, the obliteration of the traces of Indigenous life and land. And ultimately, it creates this facade of permanency, which situates the futures of Indigenous and colonized people within colonial borders. So in Palestine, these colonial manifestations include, for example, the ever-increasing enlargement of Israeli settlements, the incarceration of thousands, and the over 7 decades-long exile of more than half of our people. And this oppression in Palestine is multi-layered. Under settler colonialism, other power structures such as patriarchy and capitalism are intensified, keeping the majority of people oppressed and subjugated. And for its part, the Israeli regime has long sought to bolster patriarchal and capitalist structures in an effort to continuously disrupt Palestinian society. So I'll give you some examples. Israeli police often work with patriarchal clan heads in the 48 territories in order to sort of solve intra-communal issues. And these practices have often left women at risk and vulnerable to those that cause them harm, and it's only increased their marginalization from society. The Israeli regime forces also use gendered violence to deter women from resistance and political activism. In both these ways, they entrench patriarchy within Palestinian communities. Now, the Israeli regime has also used racial capitalist mechanisms to oppress Palestinians. For example, Palestinian workers from the West Bank are funneled into the 48 territories as a cheap and exploitable workforce. They work in very laborious and sometimes hazardous jobs for low salaries with no social protections such as insurance, etc. Meanwhile, a small group of very powerful Palestinian capitalists in the West Bank are able to exploit the situation for personal profit. And the Palestinian Authority's adoption of a strictly neoliberal economic program with its cuts to the public sector and expansion into private enterprises has exacerbated all of this. Now, these structures intersect to create a situation where the majority of Palestinians are oppressed by both colonialism, patriarchy, and capitalism. And this oppression is so deeply embedded, it's so difficult for us to imagine a future where its manifestations are not a daily reality. And even when we find the space or energy to think about a future, Palestinians are constantly told by international actors what they can and cannot expect from the future. So for the last few decades, the two-state solution was presented as the most feasible, the most rational solution by the international community. And this was premised on the notion of 2 states for 2 people, something that dates back to the 1947 UN partition plan. Now, the Palestinian leadership had long rejected partition, always calling for the liberation of Palestine from the grips of Zionist settler colonialism. But in 1974, the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, made its first nod to the solution in its 10-point program, which called for the establishment of a national authority over every part of Palestinian territory that is liberated, with the aim of completing the liberation of all Palestinian territory. In other words, they accepted that liberation might be territorially partial. Nearly 2 decades later, this position was formally adopted by the PLO at the Oslo Accords in what Edward Said called a Palestinian Versailles. For much of the international community, the Oslo Accords were embraced as this rational, phased peace plan that would put an end to the so-called Middle East crisis. The irony was that the Israeli regime, all the while, continued to build settlements and expand into the 1967 occupied territories during the negotiations, and continued even after halting the negotiations. The Israeli illegal settlement enterprise continues to expand today, depriving Palestinians from their land and natural resources, and further entrenching Israel's settler colonial role and systematic subjugation of the Palestinian people. And even with the obvious failure of the Oslo Accords to bring about a sovereign Palestinian state, the international community still touts the two-state solution as the default formula for a Palestinian future. And they're always based on these notions of feasibility and rationality. In other words, what's considered most possible and acceptable within the current circumstances. These notions are often used as an attempt to limit Palestinian imagining. And when Palestinians steer away from the future possibilities set out for them by the hegemonic narrative, they're often patronized and ignored. So considering all of this, diverting from the parameters, these parameters, and imagining our liberation and a future in Palestine is understandably difficult. Yet challenging them has to be understood as a crucial part of the liberation struggle. At a conference in 2014, I believe it was, feminist scholar Angela Davis asserted this in the context of collective liberation. And she said, you have to act as if it was possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do this all the time. So in our context, this means believing that our liberation from Zionist settler colonialism is not only possible, but also inevitable. Bringing about a society in which people no longer suffer from the oppressive manifestations of capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy requires us to redefine our national liberation struggle to one that embodies the kind of society that we want to build. And this means that our political spaces and discourses must reflect this imagined future. Imagining our liberation and incorporating it into our political movement is also where we might find joy amidst all of this despair. Italian feminist scholar Silvia Federici wrote about how important this is, this notion of joy in politics. And I want to quote something, quote from something she said. She said, joyful politics is politics that changes your life for the better already in the present. This is not to deny that political engagement often involves suffering. In fact, our political involvement often is born of suffering. But the joy is knowing and deciding that we can do something about it. It is recognizing that we share our pain with other people. It is feeling the solidarity of those around us. And so whilst the future will always be uncertain, we have to create better and more joyful spaces among one another today so that we can begin to imagine the outlines of a better world. Crucially, we can no longer accept that the Palestinian struggle to be free of settler colonial oppression is isolated from the Palestinian people's struggle to be free from other forces of oppression. Our liberation movement has to be one that tackles all forms of oppression and envisions a society that is equal and just for all. But we also have to recognize that the Palestinian struggle is inherently tied to other global and international struggles against oppression in whatever form that might be. And I think in the last decade or so, Palestinians are rebuilding connections that were once taken for granted. If we look back to the 1960s and 1970s, the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, had primarily modeled its agenda, its goals, and its tactics on the Algerian Front for Liberation, for National Liberation, which triumphed over French settlers. The PLO identified similar structures of invasion and sought camaraderie and expertise from Algerian leaders, as did Black Panthers and other revolutionaries from Latin America. Amilcar Cabral, the Pan-African revolutionary, once said, Muslims make the pilgrimage to Mecca, Christians to the Vatican, and their national liberation movements to Algiers. And indeed, after liberation from French settler colonialism, Algeria opened its doors to revolutionaries around the world. And this was a period that really embodied the spirit of internationalism. And importantly, anti-colonial struggle was at the heart of it. From Latin America to North Africa to East Asia, we saw revolutionaries, fighters, leaders donning the Palestinian keffiyeh in a nod to solidarity, but also shared struggle. Now, a lot has happened since then. Revolutionary connections have since weakened, especially with the onset of neoliberalism and policies of de-development, which have insisted on depoliticization of civil societies and the grassroots. But also the strength of narratives can't be underestimated. The war on terror that dominated the 2000s and how that demonized the Palestinian struggle for liberation, as well as wreaking havoc and destruction all over the wider Middle East. And the more recent weaponization of anti-Semitism, which among many things has seen the character assassination of political leaders who support the Palestinian struggle, like Jeremy Corbyn in the UK. In Palestine itself, the internationalist politics that once dominated the scene up until the first Intifada dissipated, and we saw a deliberate process of depoliticization and the breaking of these internationalist ties. What eventually happened was that the Palestinian leadership shifted its discourse and policies from liberation and anti-colonial struggle to that of state building in the West Bank and Gaza. Among many things, this also meant that Palestine was shrunk down, now not only to the West Bank and Gaza, but also only to certain parts of those occupied territories. In the West Bank, we're talking about these tiny Area A's, Bantustans, essentially. But amidst all of this doom and gloom, if we look back to this past decade, I think we have seen a revitalization of this internationalist politics I outlined in the 60s and 70s. It's a politics that insists that Palestine is part of the progressive political package, that it has a natural place in progressive and radical organizing against imperialism, against capitalism, against climate change, and that you can't be feminist and not support the Palestinian liberation struggle. It's a politics that is not allowing Palestine to be the exception in socialist or in leftist spaces, because many of the culprits that are oppressing Palestinians are similarly oppressing others around the world. The arms and security companies are perfect examples of that. So the framing of Palestine as part of an internationalist and radical package is important, not just for allies, but also for Palestinians. And there has to be a real reckoning with the internal domestic forces that help and exacerbate our colonial condition. And very specifically, I'm talking about capitalist and patriarchal structures, which have moved us away from collectivism towards individualism and personal gain, which is really the perfect situation for any colonial entity, because the colonized become susceptible to corruption and collaboration and divisions within their own society. It serves the Israeli settler colonial regime very well to keep the Palestinian working classes, women, and other marginalized groups doubly oppressed. And so I think here I'll end by saying that Palestine matters for the liberation of all of us, and liberation elsewhere matters for Palestine. Every colonial, capitalist, and fascist regime toppled is a win for Palestine, and Palestinian liberation in itself is a win for humanity and a win for justice.
Thank you, Yara. Questions? Is there a peace camp anymore in Israel?
No, I think the recent elections, or rather the series of elections over the last few years, have shown that when it comes to the Palestinians, Israeli society is actually not divided on the matter. Out of sight, out of mind is the best that we can hope for. But in terms of an organized political movement to end the occupation, to end apartheid, that's something that does not exist within Israeli society, sadly. And we're seeing Israeli society move further and further towards the right. Although I do think we have to be careful when talking about right and left in a settler colonial society. I'm not sure if one is better than the other.
Thank you. There's another one that is, can you expand on the concept of finding joy in activism, not falling into despair?
Yeah, and that's something that I struggle with, and I know a lot of my comrades struggle with. And so, reading the likes of Silvia Federici, I found incredibly important in how can we, and this speaks to not only Palestine organizing, but organizing in a time where we're facing massive inequality, people struggling even, to live a half decent life, paying rent and bills, and facing climate change and increased oppression of women across the world. It's very easy to slip into despair. And so I think in these spaces where we do find camaraderie, where we do organize together, it's incredibly important to prioritize joyfulness, to prioritize, to love and friendship in these spaces, because we can't organize, we can't mobilize on despair. We can't bring people to the streets just on a narrative of depression and a narrative of total negativity. We have to maintain the notion that our liberation is inevitable. Otherwise, what's the point? And so I think the likes of Silvia Federici and other writers who've written about love in politics and joy in politics is incredibly important reading for all of us in organizing spaces.
Should or shouldn't the 1948 Palestinians vote in elections, and why?
That comment is referring to Palestinian citizens of Israel, the Palestinians in the 48 territories who have citizenship and are technically permitted to vote in the Israeli elections. I am of the political camp that boycotts the Israeli elections. I have Israeli citizenship, and I refuse to take part in those elections for two reasons. Namely, firstly, because I do not want to legitimize the Israeli colonial regime over any part of Palestine, but also part of a political tactic. If we look over the years, over the decades, what has been achieved through the Zionist Knesset in terms of Palestinian liberation, it's not only very limited, but also there's only so much that Palestinian citizens can achieve through that particular political path. And I think actually it's to the detriment of the Palestinian struggle, because the Israeli regime is able to use it to show or to demonstrate that it's not an apartheid regime, because it has Palestinian, or rather what they call Arab, because they deny Palestinian identity, Arab members of Knesset. And so they can use that as a way to say, we're not an apartheid regime because we actually allow, because, good for us, we allow, Arab Knesset members. But so I think it's actually an ineffective political tactic to take part in these elections. I think it's much more effective for Palestinians to organize outside of them. And I think, at the end of the day, the problem is not with the Israeli government, it's with the Israeli regime itself. So it doesn't matter what political party is in power. The Israeli regime is premised on apartheid and settler colonialism, and that can't be challenged in the Israeli Knesset.
Thank you. Look, there are a lot of questions. I'm trying to work through them, but there's one. Thank you for your lecture. Are all of the new Israeli settlements in Palestine resisted by the Palestine administration? Are there examples of where Palestinian resistance has stopped new settlements?
Sorry, can you repeat that question?
Yeah. Are all of the new Israeli settlements into Palestine resisted by the Palestinian administration? Are there examples of where Palestinian resistance has stopped new settlements?
So the Palestine administration, which I assume here the person is referring to the PA, the Palestinian Authority, and the Palestinian Authority does not resist settlement building. It's a administrative body that was established after the Oslo Accords to manage the Palestinian populations in Gaza and in the areas A of the West Bank. So these very small Bantustans in the West Bank, not even all of the West Bank, and it does not have sovereign control over the West Bank. It only has partial control over the population's administrative control. So the Palestinian Authority is not in the business of resisting settlements. The Palestinian communities themselves are consistently resisting against settlement expansion. various communities across the West Bank, including in the South Hebron Hills, including Beta, including Nablus, Jenin areas, all over. Palestinian communities resist settlement expansion, and in some cases they have succeeded to protect their land and their communities from destruction, from theft, from violence by settlers. But this is an enterprise that is spearheaded by the Israeli regime itself. It's an enterprise that is protected by the Israeli army. And it's also an enterprise that continues with impunity from the international community. There are no serious efforts from the international community to prevent settlement expansion into the West Bank. And so in that context, it is incredibly difficult for Palestinians to physically prevent the expansion of settlements. And as we've seen really since Oslo, that more and more Palestinian land has been taken and has been swollen by these settlements. So our land is shrinking, and even when we do resist and we have small wins, in the grand scheme of things, unfortunately, it's only getting worse.
Thank you. There are a couple about the Palestinian leadership. Thank you for an excellent presentation. With the demise of the PLO leadership, where is the new Palestinian leadership emerging? Is there a reconstituting of the PLO, or is there a new mechanism emerging?
So the current leadership, the Palestinian leadership, is headed by Mahmoud Abbas, who is the president of the PLO. Unfortunately, Mahmoud Abbas is an unelected figure. He is 14 years past his elected mandate. And even though the Palestinian leadership makes sort of nonce to holding elections and makes certain excuses why it can't hold elections, the current leadership is not a representation of the Palestinian people, neither in democratic legitimacy nor in political ideology. And so we've really seen the Palestinian political leadership and its institutions become increasingly corrupt and even defunct. Now, reviving or reforming the PLO is sort of sounds like a good idea and sounds, like the way forward in theory. But the current leadership has no interest in doing that. Just to give you an example, the other day, Palestinian civil society members held a conference on the reform of the PLO, and it was brutally shut down by Palestinian security forces. So there's very little space and very little safe space to discuss or to even enact that kind of reform. It's not in the current leadership's interest to have a democratic Palestinian leadership, and it's also not in the interest of the international community or the Israeli regime for there to be a leadership that is truly representative of the Palestinian people. Both the international community and the Israeli regime want a Palestinian leadership that is compliant to them, that will continue to cooperate in security coordination with them. And so for the meantime, definitely, in the short term, I don't see any big changes with the leadership. Even if and when the current president dies, there will be a succession process in which the leadership will be handed on to the next chosen candidate, a non-elected candidate.
Thank you. There's another one. The young generation in Palestine has shifted to armed resistance, as we've seen in Nablus and Jenin recently. Do you support this form of resistance at this point of our struggle?
I think it's problematic to ask Palestinians in Palestine that question, because it can result in different repercussions, including arrest and imprisonment. I think it's important to note that under international law, occupied peoples have the right to armed resistance. And we saw indeed with Ukraine and Russia how Ukrainian resistance against Russian invasion and annexation was glorified and supported by the West, and yet In the case of Palestine, it's the opposite occurs, and it is demonized. So I think, it's very clear that kind of resistance, even though it is the Palestinians have a right to resist under international law, it's very clear that it's demonized and criminalized by the international community.
And is Israel succeeding in persuading Palestinians to leave Palestine and emigrate elsewhere?
Yeah, this is a very sad reality, and it's really part of the long game of Israel, is to create such a difficult situation for Palestinians in Palestine, such an unlivable situation that many of them will want to leave. And we're seeing that really, especially for those who are able to leave, because of course, it's not as easy as some might think. Getting a visa or, immigrating or applying for asylum is getting increasingly hard in this day and age. But those who can, I think many of my peers are leaving for a better life, for a safer life, for more opportunities. And so that's really, the end game for Israel, is to create such a unlivable situation for Palestinians in Palestine, that those who can will leave, and those who can't will be so bogged down with basic survival of the day-to-day that there'll be no energy or space left to resist the settler colonial structure.
I think we've all been here. Do you have any tips for talking to friends, especially Jewish and Israeli friends, who already have certain preconceptions from their upbringing about Palestine? It is such a difficult conversation.
Yeah, it's a very difficult conversation because, people, it's seen as such a polarizing one. But I think one of the important things, and this was something I talked about in the lectures, is de-exceptionalizing Palestine and the Israeli regime. If you're someone who considers yourself as a progressive, as on the left of the political spectrum, and you support, fundamental rights for everyone, then I think supporting Palestine is not really a big jump. And I think, drawing comparisons between the Israeli regime and other settler colonial entities, but also highlighting the settler colonial Israel's regime and how involved and embedded it is in oppression globally through, for example, the weapons and security trade, I think highlights really what Israel is at its core. So I think those points are incredibly important when you engage with folks who have preconceived notions, who perhaps come from sort of liberal Zionist backgrounds, or who have a sort of some kind of attachment to the Israeli regime. I think fundamentally you cannot consider yourself progressive if you don't support Palestinian liberation. And I think that's a good place to start.
Do you see two states or one state? And if two, on the 1967 Green Line, if not, on what borders?
I mean, I think I made it clear in the talk that I don't support a two-state solution. I think the PLO made a mistake with Oslo. And Edward Said wrote a brilliant article called The Morning After about what the Oslo Accords really were, and he saw it much before many people saw it, that this was really an agreement for further subjugation. But at its very core, I don't support or would ever promote the partition of historic Palestine. I'm not one for borders or divisions between communities and peoples. And I think the two-state solution was a cop-out, a way to sort of solve something without really tackling the root issues to the Palestinian struggle, of course, one of which is the Palestinian refugees. I mean, if you think about the Palestinian refugees who are now well over 7 million, in a two-state solution, they would not be entitled to return to their homes of origin. I think, the two-state solution also doesn't address what would happen to Israel, which is inherently an apartheid regime. It would continue being an apartheid regime in a two-state solution. So I think there are a lot of unanswered questions with a two-state solution, but I think for a world which enjoys borders and partition, it seemed like the most logical way forward, but it's definitely not something that is compatible with my politics.
Thank you. And first and foremost, thank you for your lecture, Yara. How important do you find the interlinking of struggles between marginalized and colonized people in changing the current Israeli-Palestinian paradigm? I ask this as a dual African-American Australian citizen who has over the years witnessed a significant increase in expressions of solidarity between Palestinian and African-American peoples and causes in particular.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly important that these connections and links are made. I think Palestine is not going to be liberated in a void. For Palestine to be liberated and for us to see an end to the apartheid regime, a lot of things have to change around the world. Power imbalances, a lot of politics. If you look at Europe at the moment, it's shifting heavily towards the right. It's becoming increasingly fascist, and this is not a politics that is friendly towards Palestinian liberation nor other people's liberation. So the point is that for Palestine to be liberated, we have to see politics shift massively globally. It's not going to be liberated on its own. It's going to be liberated in a global shift in politics. And so that's why, when people talk about feeling overwhelmed when it comes to Palestine, not knowing what they can do, really focusing and working on local politics is as important as doing Palestine solidarity work, changing your local governments, your national governments to ones that adopt a politics of supporting fundamental rights, of supporting liberation struggles is crucial. So you're not going to have, and we're not going to liberate Palestine here on our own if all of Europe is still fascist. And I think what we're seeing in Latin America is exciting. The sort of the shift back towards the left to governments that are very supportive of the Palestinian struggle, such as in Chile and Brazil. And I think that we have to see more of that happen.
Yara, there are a couple here on the BDS movement. One is, again, thank you for inspiring talk. You've really touched people. Could you please comment on how effective has the BDS campaign been to date in progressing us closer towards Palestinian liberation? And might just ask the other one because it's refers to what you've spoken about. You mentioned the USA views Israel as an asset, a bulwark in the Middle East. What is the most effective way to convince the US that it isn't an asset? Is it the international BDS movement? So I guess we want to, how effective do you think the BDS movement is?
So I think the BDS movement has, had some really incredible wins in a lot of different areas. Divestment, they've put pressure on many companies to divest from Israeli apartheid, and they've been successful in that. The mobilization on campuses around the world between students and academics who have boycotted complicit Israeli academic institutions. So there have been a lot of wins, and I think, as a movement, they're growing from strength to strength. And I think the BDS movement is incredibly important in the Palestinian struggle for liberation. And it puts pressure on in the right places. It adopts, the anti-apartheid struggle framework, which was very successful in the case of South Africa. So I think there are a lot of wins there. But I also think, much more has to happen. We have to see policy shifts, global policy shifts from a government level to hold Israel accountable for its crimes against the Palestinian people. And so I think that in the US, for example, while BDS is incredibly important in the US context and is having some wins, I think it's also incredibly important that people do local politics work. You know, the US government, even with we've seen with the Democrats, the Democrats and the Republicans, Israel is a bipartisan issue. They receive bipartisan support. So it's about fundamentally changing US politics. And the US is a case in point. The US is a settler colonial regime. So you're asking a settler colonial regime to end its support for another settler colonial regime. And so I think there's a lot of internal politics, or a lot of internal things in the US that have to be reckoned with before it will ever stand in opposition to Israeli apartheid. It has to reckon with its own history of settler colonialism, which of course it has not done. And so I think, just to conclude on this point, I think, the BDS movement is incredibly important. People should get involved, but so is local politics, and so is changing politics in the areas in which you live in, and investing in your communities and working with your communities to talk about Palestine and include it in this sort of progressive and radical package of politics.
This person asked, I was inspired by Colin McCann's novel, excuse my pronunciation, A Paragon, which mentions Palestinian and Jewish families who have lost children to violence, meeting together and finding common ground. Is there much of this collaboration taking place?
I think, it's that the notion of common ground is a difficult one. I think, when you have a regime, a settler colonial regime, where its colonization is ongoing, the oppression of Palestinians is ongoing, and many people within that regime are complicit in that oppression. So finding sort of common ground, I think, is not the stage we're in. I think that comes in a sort of post-conflict or post-apartheid era, and that's what happened in South Africa. Once the apartheid regime ended, that is when reconciliation efforts happened. And I think the same would be applied here. I don't think you can have reconciliation whilst the abuse and the oppression continues. And so I think, the focus has to be, for Palestinians, certainly the focus is not on that, but rather on internal politics and looking at how to mobilize Palestinians in this incredibly difficult context, and how to rebuild those internationalist links, because we are in this global situation, and Palestinians are not we're not so self-centered to think that this is the only thing that the world should care about. We are in a very difficult, globally, a very difficult situation where people are suffering from the nasty consequences of capitalism, the nasty consequences of climate change, and all of these things are related. And so Palestine has to be part of that discussion as well, where we're talking about a world that is just for everyone, where the working classes and those in the global south are suffering because of a very small minority of people. So I think in that context, we have to find, as I mentioned earlier, we have to find those spaces of joy and hope. And I think it's about coming together around a certain politics, that embraces the liberation of the Palestinian people. And I think in those spaces, I think that's the kind of common ground we should be looking for.
Well, thank you, Yara, and thank you everyone for your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't ask all of them, but thank you for your very insightful presentation, Yara, on many levels. And also, I think we want to assure you that things are moving and happening in Australia. Our new government is, we believe, moving towards some action. It's doing that slowly with its decision to reverse the decision on the previous government on the Jerusalem embassy. We're hoping the next step will be recognition of Palestine as a state. But be aware that you have, or Palestinians have, a great number of supporters in Australia. We had a poll before the previous election in March, or May it was, and it showed that the majority of Australians are aware of what's happening in Palestine and they want their government to do something. So, we are moving and we are agitating and advocating for that. So you have a lot of support. The Palestinian people have a lot of support in Australia. So thank you. And tell your friends that. And I just think it seems strange to not to acknowledge and show our appreciation in the normal manner. And I think, you'd have a standing ovation. The comments on our, preceding these questions have just been about inspiring, wonderful, insightful, just all those words that you deserve. It was a fantastic talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me and for hosting me.
It was an absolute pleasure to have someone as esteemed as you speaking.
I'm sure you'll agree that was a wonderful lecture, beautifully facilitated by Edie Bainsbury, Dr. Yara Hawari. Tell your friends, share the podcast, and remember, there's never been a better time for a free Palestine.